Hi, and welcome to this week's Letter to Past Self. Today I'm going to be analyzing the game What Remains of Edith Finch. The way I'm going to be doing this is exploring the ways to use interactive and play to communicate meaningful storytelling. First thing I did was to go to Google and search What Remains of Edith Finch and what exactly is so interesting about it. PC Gamer described Edith Finch as a narrative warrior where, with the use of different minigames to add character to each family member and tell us what the personalities they had using this. They also had strong use of color palettes and general designs of the room to let you see the mindset of each single family member. Game Crate describes the game is deals with both with death and loss, and they had a great use of written and mechanical features. They say that the Finch family stories are both whimsical and bizarre, and add a lot to the story as well as the general experience to the game. They said that they were able to add humor into the stories, but not lose the main message. And they described the Finch household serves as an excellent visual metaphor for the concept. The basic rundown of how Edith Finch works is a walking simulator where you walk through the family home of the Finch. It's not the original home, but the home that they built when they moved to Washington. This house is filled with memorials dedicated to each family member that has died within the family. It's a family that has been cursed to die at this point. Edith is the only family member who survived and has gone back look at the house because that was her mother's wishes who just recently died. She goes through the different house and exploring and reflecting on each family member, trying to figure out where this key goes. She eventually she eventually goes into different parts of the house where a family member has died and sees a memorial. She first gets a glimpse of the room where she describes different things that she remembers about those family members and what people told them about those particular people, either from her own personal memories of what her grandmother or mother has said about them. As she's exploring these rooms, she finds a particular thing that links these people to they find these people that links to how they die, either through different uses of tellings, such as for Molly, who is a young little girl, they use one of her diaries as an example of how getting into how she died. She wakes up in the middle of the night very hungry and wants to eat something, and how they're able to describe what she is reading about uh, is by actually letting you play as Molly, where you are playing the things that she's describing. She is she first describes how she was so hungry that she went into her bathroom to eat some of the holly that was in the bathroom, unrealizing that holly is quite poisonous and can cause hallucinations. So next she saw the fact that the family bird, or there was a bird outside, and she went out onto explore the trees to try and catch it because she was so hungry. Eventually kept going around until there was a jump that she was not able to make until she jumped for it and transformed into a cat and kept running around until she eventually catches the bird and ate it, and then eventually goes and becomes a bird and eats a rabbit, and then eventually becomes a shark, and then eventually becomes an octopus. They use her hallucination and imagination and how she was describing what she was seeing, using these particular like vivid things, so then you can experience what Molly might have experienced. Another example on how they were able to use this was using Barbara Finch. Barbara Finch was a 1940s child star where she was famous for her scream, Her scream made her very famous when she was a child. When she turned 16, she lost all of her fame and was more of a has-been. How they tell her demise is through a comic book panel stylized in the 1960s comics and felt very early horror films with creature features and there's cheesy horror elements where it was the horror came from how ugly the monsters were. It describes how her night went down, where she was invited to go to this convention where she would have to scream based around her famous scream. As you're going through this, it's cut into different comic panels. It's cut into different comic panels where you play a little bit of sections, and every single time text would appear on the screen, it would be in the exact same style of the books. They were able to use what understanding on how a comic strip works, but without losing the initial gameplay style of walking around and interacting with the environment they have around them. It also felt like we were in a cheesy horror film with how Barbara was reacting. They were also This was the one where they were able to use a lot of humor because there was a lot of moments which built to where Barbara could have screamed, but majority of responses were either gasp, oh my, and oh dear. It wasn't until the final bit where all the monsters come and they eat her. What was also interesting about this scene, but they do it in the other ones, is that they show different ways to also advance in the house. Like each and every single story is required to go through if you want to continue through the houses. Such as for this one, the way you get into the basement is by using a music box, which Barbara describes, and also explains why the house is built so weirdly and why Edith has to go through all these roundabout ways to get to explore the house. She, yeah, this was a great example of using a lot of interactive things to describe a meaningful story with the use of understanding its style as well as understanding how the player was interacting with and keeping it engaging. Another family memory I would like to talk about is Lewis. Lewis was Edith's older brother was a who was someone who was dealing with mental health issues. The thing that he had was coming out of substance abuse, where he would abuse a lot of substance. Eventually, he got a job working at a cannery, where he found that it was very boring. He also went to a psychiatrist, where he went and reflect and stuff. How you enter this story is by reading a note from the psychiatrist explaining how how Lewis was feeling about his job and how the events that happened, creating a psychological profile of Lewis. It starts off with Lewis working at his job at the cannery where he has to get the fish, chop the head off, and put it on the conveyor belt. And this is what you're doing as you're reading the text. It tells you that Lewis found that his job was very boring and mundane and didn't really enjoy it. As Lewis kept doing these mundane things, his mind started to wander and started imagining himself going through a labyrinth and constantly moving around it. Eventually, these labyrinths started getting bigger, where he was exploring different areas and different creatures was coming in, as well as as well as you're doing this, going through these labyrinths. You're also still cutting the fish's heads off. When you are walking through the little area where you're playing as a different person, wandering around different things, the detail and graphics of it was becoming highly more detailed. where instead of just being black outlines, they got color, they got a lot more shape, and they started to become from 2D to a more 3D aesthetic and style. The graphics within the game got higher resolutions, and the world became more in depth and became more real. As well as you kept going through and exploring the different areas, the the amount of space that this wandering idea is getting larger and larger and taking more and more of the Canary job. And this is showcasing that Lewis is believing more and more in this world and wants this to be his reality rather than working at the Canary. Eventually it gets to the point where the entire screen is gone and you can't even see the Canary cutting off the fish's head, and you're just guessing. And it gets to the point where it's completely gone, and how the fact that he wasn't losing this world that he came up for himself because he felt that he was empowered and that he was important and felt like he was doing something instead of a reflection of his real life where he was doing basically nothing to himself. It was mundane and boring. This was really cool, and I really enjoy this game. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next week.